this talk into really three parts. The first part is the pioneer flights, the route surveys, connecting India with the rest of the world in those very difficult days where the only navigation equipment was really a compass. And there were no radio beacons. The maps were at best, very, very approximate, how the routes were charted out, the different flyers who made the journeys. With that, we will move on to the second part, which is the basic airmail services, the scheduled services from different parts of the world to and through India, and within India, the development of airmails. So the first part, the pioneering part, will go on until the mid 1920s, and after that we move more into the scheduled services, which will go on till the start of the Second World War. And I will end with part 3, which is a brief narrative after the war, the development of airmails and air routes in India, which will give you a sense of where the country was headed in the late 1940s and 1950s, which is where I will end. This talk is planned to last around 30 to 40 minutes with plenty of time for question and answer after that. So Eric, you just need to interrupt me if I'm going too slow or if you think I'm running out of time. So before I start, two disclaimers. One, most of the information here, in fact, all of the information here has been put together by various other people, aviation historians and aerophilatelists before me. So really credit for everything should go to them. There may be some mistakes in my presentation, and certainly I would be responsible for those mistakes. The second is I'm going to refer to places and events contemporaneously, which means Mumbai, the city where I live, in those days was called Bombay. Kolkata today was called in those days Calcutta. Karachi was still a part of India before 1947. So it's going to be a contemporaneous talk. With that, we will start with the early days. Now, the first airmail flight in the world, I think this is something everybody is well aware of, that it was in India, the first time that airmail was officially permitted by the postal authorities to be carried. This was on 18th February 1911, when the pilot Henri Piquet flew from Allahabad to Naini in a Humber Sommer biplane and carried about 6,500 letters with him on the plane. Special cachet, which you see on the top right, was provided by the postal authorities for mail, and there was a letter rate or a postcard rate for both. It was the same half-ana postal rate for all mail carried on this flight. About 40 postcards were made with an image of the plane, which you see on the lower left. This is the aircraft, and you see the pilot, Henri Piquet, the French pilot, sitting there in the front. This card is actually, all of these 40 cards were signed by him. This one is unique in the sense it's also signed at the bottom by Walter Wyndham, and he signs as founder of Aerial Post. So Walter Wyndham was the person who organized this flight and went on later to organize the flight from Windsor to London and got knighted after that, became Sir Walter Wyndham. I do not agree with this assessment of 40 cards. In my estimate, the number should be well over 100 because these keep popping up everywhere. But Jeffrey Brown and many other people before him have recorded this quantity as well. With that, we now move to flights from Europe to India, some of the very early long distance flights. So the first was a flight from Great Britain to India The old Carthusian was the name of the aircraft. It was a Handley Page V1500 aircraft, and the pilot was McLaren. S. McLaren was the pilot. And the interesting thing is Brigadier General McEwen, who was designated to be the commander of the Indian Air Force, flew with him on this flight. The idea was to survey the route from England to India. Some mail was picked up en route. So we had about 43 letters that were picked up in Cairo for Karachi, and another 6 were picked up in Baghdad, which were flown to Delhi. So what you see here on the top left is the cover that was picked up in Baghdad and carried to Delhi. And the cachet, which you see below, is here on the letter in magenta. It says FPO 55, 3rd January 19, aerial post, Baghdad, Delhi, by Handley Page aeroplane. So this was the first really through flight from England all the way to India. Then we had the French pilot, Poulet and Benoit, who came in a Caudron G4 aircraft. They left France on 14th October 1919, and the main motivation for this flight was very interesting. This was a flight they actually intended to take to all the way to Australia. And the reason for this was the Australian government had announced a prize of £10,000 for the first person who flies to Australia, but he has to be an Australian. So these two French gentlemen wanted to beat the Australians to it, and therefore they left about a month before the Ross Smith and Keith Smith flight. So it took them via Paris, Rome, Constantinople, Bashari, Bandar Abbas, and got into Karachi, Delhi, and on to Calcutta. They reached Calcutta on 25th November 1919. And they then flew from Calcutta on 28th November to Akyab and Rangoon. But there they started having problems when they tried to fly from Rangoon to Bangkok. They had various mishaps. They had fog, burst tires, fuel problems, broken propeller, and finally a broken piston. So it was impossible to repair. The flight was abandoned, and they took the train back to Rangoon and a boat back to France. What you see here is a cover that was picked up in Bandar Abbas, and below that is a postcard with the image of the aeroplane. Then, of course, we come to the very celebrated Ross Smith and Keith Smith flight by the Vickers Vimy aeroplane. These were two Australian brothers who successfully completed the Delhi to Sydney flight. So there are only 13 known postal articles to India, which were carried either into India or out of India on this flight. So you see here a cover on the right hand side, which was carried to Delhi. And of course, this has been very well documented by Tom Frommer, every single cover on that flight painstakingly documented. And on the left, you see a rather grubby looking photograph of the Vickers Vimy aircraft in Delhi. So this was actually taken on the ground when the aircraft landed in Delhi. So this was again a very, very pioneering flight. The first time somebody flew from England to Australia and went through the very difficult part of the journey, which is over Burma, Thailand, Malaysia, etc. Now we come to 1920, and the RAF by that time had got a pretty strong presence in India. They had surplus aircraft which they had built up at the end of World War II, World War I, and they decided to start a postal service linking Karachi to Bombay. So on 23rd January 1920, they flew the first flight from Karachi to Bombay via Rajkot. So it would fly from Karachi to Rajkot on the 23rd, hold overnight up there, and fly to Bombay on the 24th. Now the letter rate at that time was half anna, and there was 8 anna was the air fee for carrying the letter. And what you see on the bottom left is a registered letter. So there was another 2 anna registration fee. So this letter is franc 10.5 anna. The 8.5 anna itself was very, very expensive. It was a lot of money in those days. And really the saving in terms of time was 1 day or at best 2 days. This service was not very popular. They were able to manage 7 flights southward, 7 flights northward, and then this service had to be abandoned. So initially, I think for the first 2 or 3 flights, it was fortnightly, then it became weekly, but it stopped with the last flight in March, early March. Now we come to the pioneering survey flights from pilots all over the world. Now, there were 2 reasons why different pilots of different nationalities flew to India and flew across India. One was, of course, it was a symbol of supremacy, technology, progress, etc. That we can fly great distances. And the second was several of these people had colonial interests. So several of the European countries wanted to fly through India to be able to reach their colonial interests to the east of India. So what you see on the left here is the American flyers. This is the world flight which was organized by the US War Department to actually be able to prove that they could circumnavigate the world. Of course, they would go by boat over some of the bigger oceans at that time. So they had used these Douglas DT-2 biplanes. Here you see all the 3 planes that took part in the flight at Karachi airport. They were called the Chicago, Boston, and New Orleans. And these planes started from Seattle on 6th April 1924, finally reaching Calcutta on 26th June 1924. In Calcutta, they were converted into land planes, and then they continued the flight back to the United States via Iraq, Central Europe, Paris, London, Scotland, Iceland, and Canada, and finally reaching Boston on 5th September 1924. There is only one cover recorded which has flown on this flight to India, which is from Calcutta to Karachi. And that cover, I have yet to see an image of that. Then what you see here on the right is a cover, is mail flown by the Italian pilot, Marchese da Pinedo. He was with the Royal Italian Air Force and flew actually from Italy all the way to Australia. Now, the interesting thing is here, you see only half a cover. So you can actually see Sydney, the last 3 alphabets, SYDNEY. So you can see the NEY of Sydney. And the reason for that is he was promised a fee of 20 Indian rupees for signing a bunch of covers. Apparently, he did not get the money. So he took a scissor and cut off half the cover, which had his signature on it. So what survives, all the covers that survive are those with just half the signature of the Italian pilot, Marchese da Pinedo. On the bottom left, you see the Danish Fokker plane, which flew again from Calcutta, and it flew all the way to Rangoon. So these were Fokker planes which left on Copenhagen on 16th March 1926. They completed their flight to Calcutta via Berlin, Constantinople, Baghdad. Of course, there were many intermediate stops. But in a total flying time of just 56 hours and 5 minutes, they were able to reach Dum Dum Aerodrome in Calcutta on 29th March. After that, again, a little bit of tragedy. They went on to Rangoon. From Rangoon, they went to Ningha in China. Unfortunately, the Chinese relieved them of all their belongings and the aeroplane, and they had to sort of, find their way back home. Then we have the Spanish flyer, which is Lorija and Galarza. They were wanting to fly from Spain to Manila, where Spain had colonial interests in Manila. So again, they had to fly through Bombay, through India. And you see here a cover, they picked up some mail in Calcutta and carried it to Rangoon. About 51 covers are known to be carried by them on this stage of the flight. Now we come to the English, for whom it was very important for them to be able to link the empire by air. So initially it was the flights to Cairo, extending it to India, from Cairo southward to South Africa, at some stage to Australia, and finally across the Atlantic to Canada. So the route surveys were entrusted to Alan Cobham, later Sir Alan Cobham. He did 2 survey flights. The first survey flight was to India in a DH-9 Moth plane, and the second one was through India all the way to Australia. So we see here a cover carried by him on the return flight, the first flight in 1925 from Calcutta to London. And here we see Alan Cobham in his seaplane. This was a Moth which they converted into a seaplane, landing on the Hooghly River in Calcutta. The RAF had already started the desert service in 1921, carrying mail from Cairo to Basra. This was taken over by Imperial Airways in 1927. The idea for them was to, of course, take the mail all the way to Karachi, but they did not get permission with the Persian government, and therefore they had to terminate the flight in Basra and carry the mail from Basra to Karachi by boat. So this flight was started on, the first flight from Karachi to Cairo was on 15th of January 1927. The letter rate, surface letter rate was 2 annas, and there was a 3 anna air fee. So you see here a letter carried on the first flight, totally franked 5 annas. And from Cairo, of course, it would go up and then go across the Mediterranean to France, and then the overland route from France to England. So that was the way they were able to save almost 3 or 4 days in the mailing time because of the Cairo-Basra service. To further expand to the east, the English gave the contract to Neville Vincent, who had this business called the Air Survey Company, who surveyed the routes from Calcutta all the way to Penang, which was in the Strait settlements at that time. And in April 1927, he carried about 16 letters with him on the flight, what you see here, and then posted them in Rangoon, where of course they were marked postage due. We also have, the French and the Dutch pilots who wanted to again create routes between France and French Indochina, and between the Netherlands and the Dutch East Indies. So these were the flights. So these were actually airmail flights. So the French and the Dutch were actually way ahead of the British where it came to developing air routes to the east and to their dominions and colonies in the east. So here we have on the left, we have the first flight, commercial flight of KLM carrying mail to the east. This was by Geisendorfer and Scholt were the 2 pilots, and they carried the mail from Calcutta, from all the way from Amsterdam to Calcutta on to Rangoon, and then to Batavia, which was the capital of the Dutch East Indies. So Calcutta, Rangoon, about 48 letters were carried, which here you see an example of one of those. And the French mail was carried by this pilot, Léon Charlet, who left on October 1927, 11th October, and the aircraft was called Roger Latapy. So that aircraft, he carried mail. And here we have mail on the return flight from Calcutta to Karachi on the flight back to France. Now, we had a lot of interest from German pilots wanting to fly to the east. So on the left, you have mail carried by Captain Otto Koenig, who flew from Cologne to Tokyo in a Casper biplane. And he had difficulties in India. He crashed at a place called Etawah, and he had to make a forced landing in a jungle. because the tail of the plane got badly damaged. And he was held up there for almost 3 months before he was able to get all the parts to repair the plane and fly on to Calcutta. So this is mail carried by him. Again, only 24 covers are known to be carried by him here. Then we have on the right hand side the all metal aircraft, the Junkers W-33L, which was flown by Baron Hohenfeld, who flew from Berlin to Tokyo in the Junkers all-metal aeroplane. He left from Calcutta on he landed in Calcutta on the 27th September 1928, left from Calcutta, and here we see mail carried by him to Tokyo. He reached Tokyo on the 18th October, and this aeroplane that was called Europa was then presented by to the Japanese aviation authorities. All the photographs that you see here, incidentally, were actually taken at Karachi. I was very, very fortunate to be able to get the entire portfolio of the official photographer of the air base in Karachi, right from, I think, 1924-25 going into the early 1930s. And these were beautiful cabinet-sized prints, 8 inches by 10 inches. So they just complement my airmail collection. Very fortunate to have those. Then we have the flight by Baron von Koenig, who flew this Clem Daimler aircraft. Incidentally, this aircraft is on display at the Mercedes-Benz Museum in Stuttgart even today. So this was a 20 horsepower two-cylinder aircraft fitted with a Mercedes-Benz engine. And he flew, he actually did the round the world flight. So he left Berlin in August 1928 and then flew eastward via Moscow, Tehran, and came down over Afghanistan and flew into Karachi, then across India to Calcutta. And from Calcutta, he went up to Singapore, from where the aircraft was put in a boat, went to Osaka, flew on to Tokyo, again shipped the aircraft to San Francisco, and then flew all across North America, finally landing in New York and completing the round the world journey. So here we have a cover carried by him on the Calcutta to Rangoon stage. Now we come to the first airmail flight from England to India, which was in April 1929. It left on Croydon on March 29th, on 30th March, and got into Karachi on 6th April. 7th April is the return flight from Karachi to Croydon. So here we see the DH-66 aircraft, the Hercules, called the City of Jerusalem, actually landing at Karachi airport, and you can actually see the dust kicked up by the aircraft as it is landing. Here we see the letter carried on the first flight from Karachi back to Croydon. So I'm purposely focusing in this presentation on mail that is more with Indian franking. So there was a 2 anna letter rate, 6 anna air fee, total 8 anna franking. I also realize I need to move a little faster. So with this, I'm now in part 2 of my talk, which is the really more carrying of scheduled mails. We've covered the pioneering mail section, where we've seen how flyers from various nationalities from all over Europe tried to come to India and across India to go to other parts of the East. Now, having established air service from England to Karachi by 1929, the next stage was to extend services further to the east. Their desire going all the way to Calcutta, which was at that time still the capital. Delhi became the capital in 1931, and at some stage extending services to Australia. Now, the government of India, which was still under British dominance, but the government of India had a very interesting rule. They said no foreign airline, including Imperial Airways, can carry mail through India. Any foreign airline can fly through India, but all mail intended for India has to be discharged at the first point of arrival, and all mail going out of India has to be picked up at the last point of departure. So therefore, Imperial Airways played a bit of a comedy. They formed this airline called Indian State Air Service, which belonged to Imperial Airways. The aircraft was Imperial Airways, the crew was Imperial Airways, but it was called the Indian State Air Service. And they had the first flight in December of 1929 from Karachi to Delhi via Jodhpur and via Hyderabad and via Jodhpur. Very quickly, Hyderabad, Sindh was dropped as a halt, and it was just Karachi, Jodhpur, Delhi. So you see here the cover, which is the first flight from Karachi to Delhi. It received this distinctive cachet for the flight. The Indian State Air Service lasted for about a year or so and got into trouble. It had to shut down. And then they had to really go to the Delhi Flying Club, which was a very, very small flying club with just 2 aircraft for their rescue. But on 2nd January 1932, the Delhi Flying Club came to their rescue, and for 1.5 years, with just these 2 aircraft and 3 pilots, were able to operate the Delhi to Karachi airmail service with an amazing amount of regularity and a very good safety record. They completed, out of the 158 flights scheduled, they completed 153. You see here the cover signed by Mr. P.D. Sharma, who was the pilot of the first flight of Delhi Flying Club from Karachi to Delhi. P.D. Sharma and his brother were both pilots. His brother was B.D. Sharma, was a pilot for the Indian National Airways. It's very, very tragic, but in a couple of years after that, both of them died uh, in air crashes. In 2 different planes they were flying, and both of them happened within 20 minutes of Karachi, and it happened on the same day. So this is just a very, very tragic story of the 2 Sharma brothers. With this, we move to mail by Air Orient and KLM. Now, the British and the Indian government did not permit Air Orient and KLM to deliver mail to India or to pick up mail from India, even though they were permitted right from 1927 for the Dutch and 1928 for the French to carry mail through India to Indochina and to Dutch East Indies. But by 1932, the British realized that extending the air service to Australia is now going to become a possibility. And in order to do that, we will need cooperation of the French and the Dutch in the French Indochina and the Dutch East Indies. So therefore, they started permitting in 1932 October, Air Orient and KLM, that if you are carrying mail intended for India, you can discharge it at Karachi. And if you are carrying mail eastward from India to further east, you can pick it up at Calcutta. So then the first airmail services of Air Orient and KLM started at that time. Then we come to the route extension from Delhi all the way to Calcutta. By that time, there was another airline formed, which was Indian-Transcontinental Airways. Now, this was in effect a partially Indian-owned enterprise, even though Imperial Airways was doing alternating flights and had considerable control over the airline. In July 1933, the flight was extended from Delhi to Calcutta via Kanpur, Allahabad, and Asansol. And we see here on the top right letter which was carried on the first flight. We see the map here, Karachi, Jodhpur, Delhi, and now the extension Delhi, Kanpur, Allahabad, Asansol, Calcutta. Here is a cover which was carried on the return flight. The printed matter rate, this letter went as a book post, so printed matter. So the rate was half anna, and there was a 2 anna air fee. And you see here the 2 anna air fee stamp affixed on it. Later in October the same year, they were able to extend the service all the way to Rangoon from Calcutta. So you see here a letter which is sent from London all the way to Rangoon, and again with the Imperial Airways commemorative cover. And you see Rangoon here with the dotted line extending from Calcutta to Rangoon. In December the same year, they were able to extend the service to Singapore from Rangoon, and that kind of marked the extent of the Indian Transcontinental Airways role. So the mail to Singapore was carried from Croydon up to Karachi by Imperial Airways, Karachi to Singapore by Indian Transcontinental Airways, and in 1934, ANA picked up the mail from Singapore and took it all the way to Brisbane. So this was the way the Empire route was extended all the way from England to Australia. The other very remarkable event that happened in 1932 was the license given to Tata. Tata was a business group in India, headquartered in Bombay, and they were given the license for the southward extension. So far mail was coming from Karachi going east, and it was covering Delhi, Calcutta, and places to the east. But what about Bombay? Bombay was the financial capital of the country already by that time. What about Madras, which was the other major presidency? So Tata got the license to collect the mail from the Imperial Airways incoming flight in Karachi and fly the mail via Ahmedabad, Bombay, Bellary to Madras. So 15th October 1932 was the flight. There was no government support given to them. It was an entirely commercial venture. And you see here the special postal cachet that was created, the special cover that was created. The cover has an interesting story. This was designed by Stephen Smith and approved by Tata. You see here the map of India, the Union Jack, and then you see the red and blue color. Now, about 11 days after this was introduced, there was a lot of protest because by 1932 already the struggle for Indian independence had started. It was considered unpatriotic, so the sale was stopped. The Union Jack was removed, the colors were changed to blue and yellow, and then what we call the Type 2 cover was then put on sale. So we have the Type 1 cover with the Union Jack, the Type 2 cover without the Union Jack. More importantly, please see the signature of Mr. JRD Tata, the pilot of this flight, the founder of Tata Airlines, and later the chairman of Tata Sons and the founder of Air India. He has personally autographed these covers. It is said that only 3 such covers are known to exist. So again, very, very fortunate to have these two with me. Neville Vincent, we talked about Neville doing the survey flight to Penang in 1927. Neville Vincent was the other pilot who took over from Tata in Bombay and continued the flight on to Madras. Here we see the aircraft landing in Madras airport and a letter carried by him on the same flight, which is again autographed by him and dated. Now in Bombay, we have the monsoons, which is from right now, from June, July, which continues till September. And the airport and also the headquarters of Tata Airline was at Juhu Island in Bombay, which for 4 months in the year would come underwater because of the tide and because of the rains. So 4 months, they would have to stop servicing Bombay and find an alternate location in Pune, which was about 100 miles away, and carry the mail by surface. So we see here a cover on the monsoon flight from Pune to Madras. The first monsoon was in May 1933, carried by them. In January 1935, they replaced Bellary with Hyderabad because of a subsidy of 20,000 rupees per year given to Tata by the Nizam of Hyderabad, who was the prince, the king of Hyderabad, and who was at that time considered to be the wealthiest person in the world. By that time, by 1930s, now other airlines had started. Indian National Airways was founded by Grant Govan. Govan brothers were the managing agents and the ticketing agents for Imperial Airways in India. They had a long history and connection with Indian aviation, and Indian National Airways, along with Tata, went on to be the two really airlines with large networks and successful airlines. So it started with the service with the Calcutta Rangoon and Calcutta Dhaka in December 1933. You see here a letter carried on the first flight from Calcutta, Rangoon to Calcutta. And in 1934, they connected Karachi to Lahore. Another short-lived service, again, this lasted only 2-3 months, was a company called Madras Air Taxi Service, which ran a service in February and March of 1934 from Madras to Calcutta, stopping at Gannavaram, Vijayawada, and Puri. Tata went on to become a very successful airline. They did a major route expansion. You see here the survey flight in 1934 east-west connecting Bombay to Calcutta via Tata Nagar, which is where India's first steel plant was set up. And the township was named in memory of the founder of the Tata Group. So it's called Tata Nagar. What you see here is the southward connection, Bombay to Trivandrum, mail carried by them on that flight. They connected Bombay to Delhi in 1937, and finally in 1946 started the scheduled mail service Bombay to Calcutta. The other interesting development before the war was the Empire Airmail scheme, which really made airmail affordable for all throughout the British Empire. So India was covered in phase 2, which was in February of 1938. So the 1.5 pence was the air fee for all mail to be carried between England to India, and from India now to any of the phase 1 and phase 2 countries, the air surcharge was removed, and the 2.5 on imperial rate was enough to send the letter. And here we see mail carried. So this was a hugely successful scheme, and airmail got a really massive boost because of this scheme. Of course, it was short-lived because September 1939 was the Great War, and airmail services were very, very restricted, and airmail charges shot up. The last phase of domestic expansion was 1939 to 1940. Indian National Airways extended their Karachi to Lahore flight all the way to Delhi. Hyderabad Air Services, which was a joint venture between Tata and the Nizam of Hyderabad, operated flights between Hyderabad to Bangalore. And Air Services India operated provincial flights within certain districts of Gujarat state. So these were the last flights before the war kind of brought a slowdown to everything. I'm sensitive to the time. So Eric, I have finished part 2. I still have part 3, which is at least 10, maybe 12 more minutes. Would you like me to stop, or would you like me to continue?
I think we can go on. I think we are good in time, and let's finish it. Yeah, 10 more minutes is fine.
Okay, thank you. So 1948, so 15th August 1947 is when India got her independence, and 8th June 1948 is a red letter day in Indian aviation, because this is the day where Air India International flew the first flight from Bombay to London. The airline was formed. To commemorate this flight, a special postage stamp was released. So what you see here is Air India International, first flight 8 June 1948, 12 hours, which was the airmail rate from India to England. Stamps were issued. The interesting thing about this stamp, and this is unique in world philately, such an event has never happened before or after. These stamps were issued, 550,000 stamps were printed, issued only to be valid for 1 day, for 8th June 1948, and that too only to be used on mail carried on that flight. So this plane left Bombay, flew to Cairo, Geneva, and London, and carried mail on it. So if you had a letter on that, you could stamp it with the stamp, and it would be carried, and that was it. You could not use this stamp postally after that. So this was something absolutely fantastic. Here we see the plane, the L-749, the Lockheed Constellation. It was called the Rajput. It was meant to be the Rajput Princess, but later replaced by the Malabar Princess. and flew from Bombay to London. Air India made special souvenir covers. Again, these are very popular and quite easily available to celebrate this flight. Air India went on then, after having reached London, they carried very limited amount of return mail. So you see here the return flight cover from London to Bombay. It is believed that only about 50 such covers are known. And here you see a return flight cover from Geneva to Bombay. Again, the quantity known is anywhere between 25 to 50 covers. And almost, other than one example I have seen of a not registered, an ordinary mail, airmail cover, all the covers that were carried were registered mail. For some reason, all the ordinary mail covers came a week later on the flight which landed on 21st June. Air India then went to extend the flight from Bombay to Calcutta. Mail on the first day carried this Calcutta and to London cachet, which was in 17th October 1950. The other two interesting developments was the night airmail service. This was a very daring service that was introduced in January 1949, where the mail would be transported overnight within India between various cities. And it later became also the all-up airmail rate was created. Now this night airmail service was rather innovative. So the four major cities in India were in the north, east, south, and west of the country. Nagpur was right in the middle. So planes would leave from Delhi, Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. All would converge in Nagpur. They would interchange, exchange mails, and then the aircraft would turn around and go back. So that mail delivered as late as 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. in any of these four cities would actually be delivered in the first post in the morning at 9:30. However, the safety record on this flight was rather dismal. There were no proper night flying facilities. There were, the airports were ill-equipped to handle it. And between 1949 to 1953, there were several crashes of aircraft, which gave this scheme a very, very bad name. After that, of course, we had a few innovative flights. So Indian National Airways, we talked about them earlier, extended services to Rangoon. On the bottom left, we see Bharat Airlines, which extended the flight to Singapore and later went on to fly to Saigon and Tokyo. And then you have Himalayan Airways, which started the Indo-Afghan air service, flying to Kabul and Kandahar. So these were just as the nation became sort of independent and more influential in the region, one way of extending the influence was also to extend airlines, air services, and airmail services to those countries. Then we have the big event in August 1953, nationalization of air transportation. So there were at that time about 10 or 11 domestic airlines flying. All of them got taken over by the government, and Indian Airlines Corporation was formed. The international airline was called Air India International. Since it was the only airline, it continued to be called Air India International. But what was earlier owned 49% by Government of India became 100% Government of India enterprise. And until deregulation in the early 90s, all air transport in India from 1953 was government owned. Air India went on to become, through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, the finest airline in the world. The early route expansion was to Aden, Nairobi, later to Hong Kong, on to Japan. They had services to Moscow. They had several services to Europe, which they extended to the United States. And then they had the Africa route. Here we see what Kai Tak Airport in Hong Kong looked like in the early 1950s. And then they extended also the services from Madras to Singapore, Jakarta, and on to Australia. You see the mail here in October 1956 to Australia. And the crowning glory for them was when they got the Boeing 707 aircraft. In March 1960, they started flying Bombay-London on 707, extending it across the Atlantic in April 1960 to New York. We see the Air India 707 at Idlewild Airport in New York. And here we see a postcard carried on the flight signed by the entire crew. So I have the last slide of my presentation here. JRD Tata, who flew this first flight in 1932, went on to become chairman of Air India and chairman of the Tata Group, reenacted his flight on the 30th anniversary in 1962 on 15th October, flying the same aircraft from Karachi to Ahmedabad to Bombay. This is mail carried on that flight. And one more time in 1982, when he was 78 years of age, and you see him here at the age of 78 flying the same aircraft again from Karachi to Ahmedabad to Bombay. He is regarded as the father of Indian civil aviation, the grand old man of civil aviation. He was awarded the Bharat Ratna, which is India's highest civilian honor, and very affectionately regarded by all airmail enthusiasts in the country. So with this, I will come to the end of my talk. Thank you for hearing me out. I'll stop sharing my screen so you can see me. I'll be happy to answer questions.